Hi, this is Woodwork Designs by Z, and today I'm going to be building a planter for my grandmother entirely out of scrap wood. Keep watching to see what happens. So, the first thing I do is go over to the miter saw and cross-cut one of these long 12-foot white oak boards down to a rough length. This board is what I plan to make the legs of the planter out of. So, my grandmother actually had an old planter that I had made for her about 6 or 7 years ago. At this point, the planter was falling apart because I had only made it with cedar shiplap with miters in the corners and dug for 4x4s for the legs. The legs were rotten and the miters were opening up because I only put them together with a little bit of glue and a bunch of pin nails. I did this before I had any of the tools I have now or the skills. So I told my grandmother I wanted to make her a new planter, and she said it was okay as long as it didn't cause me a bunch of stress. I assured her it wouldn't, and that this would be a fun project for me. The reason I say this is because I actually forgot to get any sort of footage of that planter before disassembling it and throwing it away after delivering this new one to her house. At the beginning of this video, I said that this entire project was made out of scrap wood, and these boards might not look like scrap wood, but they actually are. So, my definition of scrap wood is any sort of lumber that's left over from another project or sitting around your shop not doing anything. And these boards were actually left over from a project that I did for one of the houses that my dad built recently. For that project, I had to mill about 250 to 300 linear feet of white oak to make a bunch of box beams. A box beam is basically a three-sided trough that gets mounted on the ceiling over an existing structural beam to cover it up and make it look like a big thick timber. When I did that project, I had these 3 boards left over, and when I decided to make this planter, I decided to use these boards because white oak is naturally weather resistant. Most people don't associate white oak with being weather resistant, but it actually is. I'm trying to use up a bunch of scrap wood right now throughout my shop. I'll talk more about why later. So, what you saw me do back there was cut all of the miters for these legs. These legs are actually made up of 4 sides and then are going to be hollow on the inside. So what I'm doing now is taping all of the miters shut. This is so that way I can then apply the glue and then roll the pieces up like a burrito. After I apply all the tape to the joints, I inspect the miters to make sure there's no gaps. I want to do this because if there are gaps and I go to glue it up, I don't want to end up ruining these pieces and have to start over. Luckily, these pieces had no gaps because my miters came out nice and tight. After that, I untape one side and then unroll this. I then apply a bunch of glue and spread it around. I don't have to worry about squeeze out here because the inside will never be seen and the outside can get cleaned up at the drum sander later. The glue I'm using here is Titebond 3, which is a waterproof wood glue. And if any of you are woodworkers and you know, then you'll know if you get Titebond 3 on your clothes, it never comes out in the wash, no matter what soap, what detergent, what hot water, cold water, nothing. So I'm not worried about this being outside. Next, I apply a bunch of clamps. Even though I have the tape on the miters, I want to make sure I get a little more clamping pressure to make sure these miters are good and tight. I have to apply clamps evenly, otherwise I can end up pushing the miters in one direction, causing these pieces to become out of square. Then, I wipe the glue off the outside. Like I said before, I do plan to send these boards through the drum sander, but I want to get the glue off as much as possible now, so that way I don't have to worry about them being lumps and then causing it to be sanded, not flat. I then get out the drum sander, which I think had 150 grit sandpaper on it, and I send these boards through. It really didn't matter what grit sandpaper it was, because I do plan to use the orbital sander afterward to get a nice smooth finish. So, earlier in the video, I was talking about how I wanted to use up a bunch of scrap wood in my shop, and over the next couple of videos, they're actually going to be a series, which I'm going to call my scrap wood series, where I'm trying to use up a bunch of the scrap lumber laying around my shop. The reason for this is because one of the projects that my dad's going to be building in the fall is a house. It's actually a renovation, and in this renovation, the existing house has about 7,000 square feet of black walnut hardwood floors. For this renovation, the client decided they wanted to get rid of all 7,000 square feet of walnut floors and replace them with white oak, which means that there's going to be about 7,000 square feet of walnut floors that no one has anything to do with. So I will end up with as much as I can fit in my garage. Right now, I have way too much material to fit those pieces in my garage, so I'm trying to use up as much material as possible to have room for those pieces. What you saw me do back there was get out the planer and plane down this piece of rough sawn white oak I had laying around from something. This is going to be used to make the stretcher pieces that the vertical slats will sit in for the sides. This piece had a crack in it, so I was being very careful when cutting it to try to eliminate as much of the crack as possible. The reason for this is because I couldn't just cut off a bunch off one end to cut the crack off, because I needed as much of the length as that board had. Then, I decided to make a bunch of the vertical slats. For this, I was going to use this piece of reclaimed white oak that I had. But after planing it, I realized that I don't think it was white oak at all. As wood ages, it becomes harder and harder to tell what it is. And after planing, I figured out that I think this was a piece of hickory. If anyone knows for sure, let me know in the comments. So, after that fail, I decided to set up a stop block on the miter saw and use any other scrap pieces of white oak I had laying around my shop to make the slats. These were random offcuts from other projects, and since the slats didn't have to be very long or wide, it worked great to use up these pieces. I'll save that piece of hickory for a different project. So, I have a favor to ask of my viewers, and no, it's not will you like and subscribe, although while we're at it, it'd be nice if you would like and subscribe. The favor is this. I'd like to know, do you prefer watching longer form videos like this, where I make complex projects, or do you prefer watching shorter videos that I might be able to produce more often with shorter projects? Let me know, because I'd love to make the videos you're looking for. Also, if you have any sort of other criticism for me, of course, be nice when you say it in the comments. I'd love to hear it, because for some reason, whenever I ask any of my family what they think of the video, it's always, it's great, and it's perfect, and it's really hard to get a true, honest opinion. So after ripping all those slats, I then went over to the planer, and I planed them down to a 1/2 inch. I thought about resawing them, but by the time I was done, I wouldn't have been taking off very much, seeing as they started at 3/4 and would have been left with just a thin sliver that I'd have nothing to do with. It did take a couple of passes to get them there, and I ended up overfilling the dust collector. When that happens, the sawdust backs up and goes through the impeller. It's a big pain to then have to go clean out, and I need a way to figure out when the dust collector is full, so that way that doesn't happen. This new planer I got works great, but it really does fill up the dust collector much faster. I say new planer, but I did get this about 6 months ago. I just haven't produced very many videos recently, so it looks fairly new. Next, after doing that, I decided to go back and work on the stretcher pieces. I set up the table saw to cut a channel. This is how those slat pieces will fit into these. As you can see, I cut a nice 1/2 inch channel into these pieces of wood. This will be for those slats, like I said before. Here I am, slightly out of frame, testing to see if those pieces fit. If only I was moved slightly over, you could have seen it. Next, I decided to add a chamfer to one side of these slats. The reason for this is because if there's any sort of undulation between the slat pieces, the chamfer will kind of even it out. It will also give a little shadow line between each slat, so that way it looks cool. It's not really for any sort of purpose, it's mainly just for aesthetics. I only chamfer the front edge. I don't chamfer the back of the slats because I didn't see it necessary. Next, I cut all these slats to the right size. It didn't matter what size I cut it to, I just needed them all to be the same. It was whatever looked proportionately correct at that moment. And I think it came out pretty good. When I first started this project, I thought this would be an easy project that wouldn't take very long. And as I kept building this, it kept taking longer and longer and longer, and it ended up being a really long project. It also took a lot of figuring out, and it was a fun project too. Next, I cut these stretcher pieces to the right length. As you can see, I'm cutting off barely any because that board was just barely long enough. It worked out perfectly. Next, I cut the smaller stretchers to the right size. These are for the short sides of the planter. Then, to assemble this, I put finish into the trough, and then I stuck each slat piece in with a piece of index card that had been folded 4 times in between each one to act as a spacer. This will allow these boards to expand and contract. Now, I didn't want all these slats to end up bunching up on one end if they were truly floating, so after that, I then went over and I turned the piece around and I nailed each one from the back, 1 nail on each side in the center. This will still allow these boards to expand and contract without them all getting bunched up on one side and seeing one big gap. Next, I cut the legs to the right size. This wasn't too difficult, although I did have to rotate them a couple of times because they were too big to do in one pass with the table saw. To assemble this whole planter, I plan to use dominoes, and I put dominoes into the top and bottom stretchers. These side pieces are not really connected together. The slats are supposed to be mostly floating, like I said before, for expansion and contraction, but I did nail them because, like I said before, I don't want them to get bunched up on one end. So these dominoes are what's going to give this thing strength. I was a little hesitant at this point, a little bit nervous that it wasn't going to give it enough strength, but after building this planter, it came out perfect, and it was plenty strong enough. Then, I marked out on the legs exactly where the dominoes go to make sure that they all ended up in the right spot. If I messed that up, then the whole planter wouldn't go together, and I might have to start over making one of these pieces. Luckily, though, it all worked out, and it all fit together perfectly. The domino really does make that easy. Next, I had this one crack to deal with that I wasn't able to cut out. Luckily, the crack wasn't compromising the strength at all. It was mainly just for aesthetics. And to get the glue into the part of the crack I couldn't get to, really, I used the vacuum to suck the glue through. It works great. Now, I'm not too worried about the way this crack looks because it's on the inside, and this planter is going to my grandmother's house. And from my experience, grandmothers, aunts, uncles, any sort of relatives like that really don't care how the thing looks. It could look 100 times worse, and they would still love it because I built it. I don't know why it's that way, but for some reason, when I asked my grandmother, I said, "This planter's much better than the other one, right?" And she was hesitant to say yes. I asked her why, and she said, because she didn't want to put anything down that I made. I was like, really? But I'm still holding myself to a good standard and making sure to make this planter much better than the other one. For the plants to actually sit in this planter, I don't want them sitting on the wood because the wet dirt will end up causing it to rot. So, even though the white oak is naturally weather resistant, it's a good idea to have the plants in some sort of liner. I couldn't find a good liner for the inside, but I did find these bins, and 2 of them together fit pretty much perfectly inside of this planter. I did have to cut that lip off of the side though, which wasn't too much work with the multi-tool. As you'll see, it was like a perfect fit. I did not plan it this way, and somehow, it just kind of worked out. Next, I have to start working on some slat pieces that will go on the bottom of the planter to hold these bins. I'm not doing a solid bottom because I want to drill some holes in the bottom of the bins to allow the planter to drain. I'm not trying to make a swimming pool. And I don't want the water sitting on top of any sort of pieces of wood because I don't want the wood to rot. When making stuff for outside, you have to be very careful about water. So, on that note, you might be saying to yourself, wow, those pieces look an awful lot like red oak. And you'd be completely correct, they are red oak. The reason I decided to use red oak for these pieces is because I had some red oak left over from a picture frame I made maybe 1-2 years ago. I don't remember at this point. I just remember they were the perfect size, and I don't have to worry about them rotting even though they're not white oak, or about them ever being seen. Even if they were seen, the finish should help them blend pretty well with the white oak pieces. But the reason I don't have to worry too much about that is because they're on the bottom of the planter. They're just there to hold the bins in place. So, to attach these pieces, I cut a couple of notches. This is so that way they can sit up on top of the stretcher pieces and down next to them. That didn't make much sense in my explaining, but you'll see as I put it together. I then use some dominoes to connect these. I probably don't need them because of the way these are going together, but this is just kind of going to hold them in the right place so that they don't end up moving around. Next, I add the dominoes to the sides. If you're wondering, these pieces are not evenly spaced across the bottom. They're in a spaces just so that way the bins will sit on them, one on each side of the bin and then one in the middle of each bin. Next, I pre-finish all of the pieces before gluing it up. This works great, and I only do one coat, just enough so that way any sort of squeeze out I have, I can use a damp rag to wipe off without causing it to soak into the wood and raise the grain, or the glue soak into the wood and compromise the finish later. I only do one coat because that's all I need, and it's still repairable later. I do use painter's tape where I don't want any of the finish to go because the glue will not stick to the finish, and that would cause the planter to fall apart. I plan to glue this planter up in sections. I first glue on these pieces onto the two long sides and make a long side assembly. I put the glue and then put the dominoes in. Some of these dominoes are a little bit tight and I have to use a little mallet to hammer them in. I then put them together. Here you can kind of see how it's going to work, where that notch kind of fits over the stretcher pieces for the sides. After doing one, I was able to do them all. This was one of the easier glue ups for this whole planter. It wasn't stressful and it was actually went together very easy. Later on, you'll see how one of the other glue ups was not so easy. It's okay if I have a little bit of squeeze out right now because I did apply the finish beforehand. So, like I said when I was applying the finish, I can easily use a damp rag to wipe it off, and it will not wipe the finish off either. You just have to make sure the finish is dried long enough. I like to wait a couple of days after applying the finish, or whatever the finish recommends. Then I put on the other side. While doing this glue up, I was a little nervous how heavy this whole planter was going to end up turning out, but it wasn't too bad in the end. I did have to use the rubber mallet a little bit to persuade these pieces together. Then I applied clamps where there was each stretcher piece. I didn't want to apply too much clamping pressure because I didn't want to end up marring up the surface, just enough to hold these pieces together while the glue dried. Next, I used a damp rag to wipe off the glue. I don't have to be too careful here because despite what you might think, the rubbing of the wet rag on the finish really doesn't mess up the finish at all. It actually doesn't at all. I mean, nothing. There's no scuff marks or anything, even only waiting like 24 hours. Then I glue up the short sides. I glue the short sides to the legs, which I'll then glue to the long sides later. It's the same sort of process as gluing up the rest of it. Put glue, put dominoes, then put the pieces together. I don't remember exactly what size dominoes I used here. I think they were 8mm, but I had to make sure to put the dominoes into the sides first and then into the legs, because if I put them into the legs and then tried to put the sides in, the legs are hollow and it would end up pushing the dominoes right into the center of the legs. I then applied 2 clamps because I didn't need ones in the middle because there was no glue on the slat pieces. Next, this was the most stressful glue up of the whole project, because it was big and bulky and I didn't have clamps long enough. Also, I had to work fast because it was hot in the garage and the glue was drying. I put the dominoes in, put the glue on, and then I stuck the leg assembly on. It took a little bit of fighting with it to get these on because somehow the pieces were kind of not lining up. They weren't off by much, and I was able to use the rubber mallet and some clamps to get these sides on. They were only off by maybe a 32nd of an inch or a 16th. It wasn't enough to where I'd have to like rebuild anything. Then I did the other side. It was the same as before, It was hard, it was difficult, and it didn't line up perfectly, but I did get it. Now, when I try to put clamps on this is when I really have the issue. I originally tried clamping it to the stretcher pieces at the bottom, thinking I'll do that and then do maybe 2 clamps along the top or something to allow to be able to get a clamp along the top, because I didn't have any clamps long enough, like I said before. Well, I tried to clamp the stretcher pieces, and I'm not showing it, but I kind of moved them a couple, and I was kind of panicking because I didn't know what to do. Luckily, I didn't break any of them, and they were still okay. And due to the way that they're attached, they're not going to come out. Then you can see how I don't have any clamps long enough, so I used 1 parallel clamp and 1 F-style clamp to kind of get clamping pressure. Throughout this whole project, this was the one glue up I was dreading the most, and I kind of turned the camera off, and eventually I got it, but here you can kind of see how it went. After the glue up was done and I waited a long enough time for it to dry, I did not take the clamps off early. I wanted to make sure it dried thoroughly, because if I had to reclamp it, that wouldn't be good. I then went and I put all the clamps away. Next, I got to feel how heavy this thing really was while I tried to lift it to the floor. It wasn't too bad. I was expecting it to be slightly heavier, so I was able to do it. Next, I decided to start working on the cap for the top of this planter. This cap is going to have a unique design. It goes around the outside and splits it into 2 compartments due to those 2 bins, which I think actually looked good. I was afraid it wasn't going to look too good, but it came out pretty good. So, I first start out by ripping the 2 outside edge pieces, and then I'm going to rip the end pieces and the one for the center. Those are thicker than the outside edge pieces, and that'll make a little bit more sense in a little bit. It's just because of the shape of those bins. I then roughly cross-cut them to the right size. Next, to figure out the angle for this miter, because it's not going to be a 45-degree miter, it's a different angle, I overlapped the pieces, made sure they were square, clamped them in place, and then used the edge of the square as a straight edge to go from point to point to mark it out. I then took one of the short pieces and set up the miter gauge to cut that to the right angle. Then, I used that piece to mark out onto the long piece exactly where that angle needs to be and what that angle is. Afterward, I had to get creative. How do I plan to cut the long sides, because that miter gauge doesn't tilt to that angle? So, I used some leftover pieces of red oak to make a jig that will allow me to hold those pieces kind of vertically against the blade. It doesn't make much sense, but it kind of will. Basically, what I'm trying to do is get the complementary angle of that other one. As long as I don't move the miter gauge when I put these pieces in, they should give me a perfect complementary angle, giving me a 90-degree joint. I just use some screws to connect these pieces together into this L shape, and then I screw it to my miter gauge. I'm only screwing it through the wood piece that I added to this miter gauge, so I'm not hurting the miter gauge at all. Here, you can kind of see how that's going to work. I can clamp that piece into place with a clamp, and then I can cut it. The reason I'm clamping it and not holding it is because I don't want my fingers so close to the blade. But here we go. Now that makes a little more sense. It's not vertically to the blade, but it's not like across the miter gauge either. It's like up against the miter gauge. I should have said 90 degrees to the miter gauge. That would have made a little bit more sense. Here you can kind of see how that angle works. Next, I took the 2 pieces and held them together just to make sure that they were going to be the right joint. Then I checked it for square, and luckily it was perfect. So, because that worked so well, I went through and cut the rest of the pieces with this. I ended up cutting the long sides first, because that jig was still attached to my miter gauge. Then I'll go back and cut the rest of the short sides, which is what I'm doing now. So, I know I already asked you to subscribe and to like, but I would love it if you would share this video, because it'd be great if I could start getting paid to do projects like this from YouTube, because it is really nice to do projects for my family completely free of charge and then gift it to them. I just gotta figure out how to pay for materials. To assemble this whole cap, I plan to use dominoes. I'm actually using two different sizes of dominoes. For the inside of the miter, I'm using some longer, bigger 5mm by 30mm, and then for the outside, I plan to use some small 20mm or by 4mm dominoes because it's a shallow miter and I don't want them poking through the edge. I also domino out for the inside divider piece. I thought about maybe gluing this together and then adding some bow ties or something as an accent, but I figured since there was no other accents throughout the whole thing, it might have just looked weird. I then glued this up, and this actually was very straightforward. It worked out very well to get clamping pressure on this. I was a little worried about those miters since I couldn't clamp them long ways, but because they were so shallow there, I didn't have to worry at all, and the clamps did not push the other pieces outward. After that glue dried, I then added a small 1/4-inch roundover to the top of the cap. I tried an 1/8-inch roundover originally, but I didn't like the way it looked. I thought it was a little too small, so I switched to a 1/4-inch and it came out perfect. Sometimes it's hard to decide what sort of edge profile you want to do for a project, so you just kind of have to pick one. The only thing that I didn't like was how the roundover bit left a little radius in the corner. This is just what happens when you use routers, so I used a sharp chisel to kind of clean that up and make that look good. It takes a little bit more practice for a roundover versus a chamfer, but it's not too difficult. I then use the offcuts from the legs to kind of mark out where the legs are going to go, so I can glue these pieces on, which I did put a domino in. These pieces will allow the cap to be able to sit right down on top of the legs, and these fit into the hollow legs. One of the benefits of having a hollow legs means you can index this cap perfectly. And I don't have to mechanically fasten this cap on. There's enough friction between the cap and the legs with these pieces, so that way the cap doesn't easily come off. But if you ever want to take the bins out, you can still. Just pull the cap off. Next, I sanded everything. I think I sanded this whole project up to 180, not 240, because I didn't need to sand super high. It was an exterior project. I also sanded the outsides of the legs at this point. I don't think I said why I didn't originally sand and finish them. It's because when I clamped the whole piece together, I was afraid the clamps were going to end up marring up the outside leg surfaces, and I didn't want to then have to re-sand off the finish. Next, I applied the finish to the legs and the cap. I just did one coat here, let that dry, and then I'll come back and do another 2 coats over the whole thing together. Those other 2 coats will seal up the joints. Even though I used waterproof wood glue, it was still a good idea to make sure to seal up the joints. I started by finishing the underside of the cap. Then I could flip it over and set it on those 4 posts and finish the top, because if the finish got marred on those 4 posts, you're never going to see it. Also, I never said what finish I was using. I was using this Pure Luxe from PPG, and this stuff is like a very durable exterior grade finish. Most people probably know it as Sickens, but when it was bought out by PPG, they changed the name. To protect the bottom of these planter legs, I wanted to do something, and it took a little bit of figuring out of what I wanted to do, but I used some Total Boat Thixo epoxy, which is basically a thickened epoxy that mixes in the tube, and I used it to glue some thin pieces of acrylic onto the bottom of these legs. Next, I used a router and a flush trim bit to flush trim off the extra acrylic and make them flush. I don't foresee you ever actually seeing these pieces of acrylic, and these will protect the bottom of the legs from wicking up any sort of moisture and causing them to rot, because end grain is one of the most susceptible areas of wood for moisture. I then added a small chamfer around the bottom of the pieces of acrylic, and now you get to see this satisfying shot of me peeling off the tape that was protecting the legs from the epoxy and from the trim router. Then I drilled one hole in the bottom, which you might be thinking, won't that allow water in? And no, it's actually to allow water out. Just in case any water gets into the hollow part of these legs, I didn't want the water to be stuck inside of there without a way to get out. Then I have to try to flip this thing over, which is harder than just lifting it off the bench from earlier because it's this big bulky shape and it's kind of top heavy. When I banged it against the ground there accidentally, I was afraid it may have broken it, but it didn't. It's not that fragile. I don't know why I keep thinking it is. I then took these blocks that were kind of stuck to the top due to the still tacky finish off. The reason I didn't have this thing sitting directly on the ground is because I just didn't think it was a good idea to have the finish completely touching the ground. Next, I put the bins in, and you can see how it kind of was just a perfect fit. Next, I drilled a bunch of holes in the bottom of the bin because, like I said earlier, I'm not trying to make a swimming pool. Plants don't like to go swimming. They like to grow, and they do need water, but not a swimming pool's worth. When I drilled the holes, I make sure to avoid the pieces where those stretchers go across. Next, I set the cap on, and you can see how it fits right down on. Let's check out these final photos. I love the way this planter turned out, and my grandmother was thrilled. Thanks for watching.